everyone. We're going to get started on the next session now. So I'm Amanda Baker. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate at UCLA, and I study risk-taking and anxiety with Adriana. So I'm really excited to introduce our speakers. So we have Wouter van den Bos, who is a professor of developmental psychology at the University of Amsterdam and also a researcher at the Max Planck Institute. And then we have Molly Pencke, who is the manager of the Bezos Scholar Foundation, which is a youth leadership development program. So the topic of our session is how do we support risk-taking? So why don't we start with you, Wouter? How do you feel like you think about this in your work?
All right. Hello. Yeah. Well, I'm really happy to be here. So thanks again for inviting me. I've been thinking about this question. I really like the question, like, how do we support risk-taking? When I started as a PhD student, also in the field of adolescent decision-making, the question was the opposite, basically. It was all focused on the negative, and we talked about this before. It was really like, how do we prevent risk-taking, and why are adolescents taking risk? And we're starting to look at, the neuroscience and learning really interesting things. But in the meantime, also asking this question is like, why are they taking these risks? And I think the perspective has been shifting also to see like, okay, there's actually positive risk-taking, and they actually need to take some risks. And then, an example of positive risk-taking would be also to stand up for a bully, for instance. You take a risk, but might have negative consequences for yourself. And I think those are the... And so when I was thinking about this question, is like, what are the types of risk-taking that we want to support? Because not all of them. Like the negative ones that I started with, that would be like, whatever, crime or something. You don't want to support all risk-taking, but I was thinking, so the positive one, but the one for this conference and the topic of this conference, I thought something else, it would be more like smart risks, right? So the notion that you take risks that are smart in the sense that you learn something by taking the risk. And I think that's something we can or should support. And I think that's an interesting frame of thinking about these types of risks. Like you do something and you actually learn something from it. And also for the adolescents to start thinking about this in this way, they can actually maybe also make even smarter risks. Like really think about like, okay, what do I learn about when I do this? What do I learn about myself or about the world when I take this action, right? So, and it's actually similar to, I saw the analogy with my own work, basically with doing scientific experiments. Like if you do them right, I mean, there's always risky because you don't know what the outcome is, but if you set it up right, you always learn something. Like you can't really fail. Like a failed experiment is just a bad experiment. You don't learn anything, right? So it's just, that's the only way to fail. So to learn, to basically to become, I think for adolescents to become sort of, life scientists, right? Sort of set up life experiments where they think about this in a different way. It's like, oh, this is a learning opportunity, and if I do this, how do I learn? What's the best way to set it up that I actually learn? If I want to know what it's like to be at a party, should I go there and drink as much as possible within half an hour and end up in the emergency room? Probably didn't learn a lot from it, right? So there's a different approach to it. You can have a strategy, because I think a lot of the risk-taking adolescents do, they think about it a lot in advance. It's not all this impulsive craziness, but it's also, they make plans. And if we can help them incorporate sort of this type of thinking, we can support that risk-taking. And I think the other part of it is so that we rephrase this sort of this failure, in the sense that, like, as I said before, like a good experiment cannot fail because you learn something anyway. So if you do it like this, and if you think about your behavior like that, you have more freedom to explore, because even if the thing that you thought would happen didn't happen, or you went to acting class but you didn't like it, or you were just really bad at it, that's fine, right? In a sense, okay, you learned something. And then in that way, there's always this sort of positive spin on it. And I think also, so there's really about changing the language and the thinking about this type of risk-taking that adolescents can benefit from. So that was one idea. And
yeah, I really like that. And I feel like that goes into what we were talking at our table, where kind of the stress about making the right choice, or even after you've made the choice, like, did I make the right choice? And instead of focusing on, was this the best choice I could have made, you could focus instead, what did I learn? Or was I able to learn from it? That's really different.
Exactly, yeah.
All right, how about you, Molly? How do you feel like you think about this in your work?
Well, first I just want to say hello, good morning. It's good to see all of you. I'm honored to be here, and I appreciate you making some time to talk about these things. I was laughing with my colleague that if teenagers knew we were all sitting in this room talking about them this way, they would probably get a good chuckle. So just to clarify, I am the manager of the Bezos Scholars Program, which is a program of the Bezos Family Foundation. So I'm based in Seattle, Washington, but I manage a year-long leadership program for teenagers. Many of them come from various locations in the United States, and we also have a cohort coming from a leadership academy in South Africa called the African Leadership Academy. So one of the favorite parts of my job is bringing together young people from all over, rural, suburban, urban, different parts of the States, as well as different countries in Africa. And they're all yearning to connect. And what is an always interesting reminder to me as I think you think about diversity is, oh, you know, young white folks who aren't living in an area where there's a lot of people who are different than them. And in many of our scholars, they say, my whole community is Latino, and I really want to meet people who are different than me. And so I think it's also really enlightening, no matter what identity you represent, that they just want to connect and they want to be seen. And so a lot of the risks that we ask students to take in our program are to develop a community change project. So we take them on a journey of exploring who they are, what they care about, where they come from, and then what needs they see in their community. And like Wouter was saying, there's real power in language. So if you say, what's the issue, what's the problem, that's a real, like, not asset-based way of thinking about it. So we're just like, okay, what are needs that you all have that are unmet? Like, who is it impacting most and why? What voices are being heard and not being heard? And they slowly start to develop a team, an idea, and an approach to making a meaningful difference on the need. And they're defining what the meaningful impact is. I'm not telling them this, you know, you need to engage 1,000 people and, you know, this is your outcome. They're figuring that out. And a lot of that risk is really exploring, like, okay, here's a challenge in front of me. Like, where do I even begin? Many students start with a very clear idea of what they want to do, and when they engage with community, it completely changes. Other people have 8,000 ideas, and they can't focus, right? And so they need a little guidance. But the real big risk is asking them to try something they've never done before and to put themselves out there in front of peers, educators, their family. And we try and redefine failure. We talk a lot about that. And really even using the word failure, we'll use it, but we'll say, well, what would failure look like to you? Like, what does that even mean to you? And similarly, we always do a process of, you know, you come up with an idea, you vet it with people that it's going to be, that they're going to be a part of. You try it, you iterate it, you celebrate what you did, and then you reflect about it. And that cyclical learning is what I think moves them from either I failed or I didn't, because it's never that cut or dry, even if you're defining what you did as failure. And so it's a really fun and exciting thing to do, but I think we always start with belonging and building what we call brave space, because I can't actually guarantee the space will always be safe for you. But we do have, like I think you mentioned earlier, Jamila, a code of conduct that we start with as a baseline, but they build their own agreements, and similarly, they hold each other to them. And what I have found is, like, you don't need much to change how a community engages with each other. And if a young person is used to competition, being shot down, being told they're wrong, if you create a space doing little tiny rituals and things that are different, they are so excited to support each other. They're their biggest champions. They cheer each other on. And a lot of our activities are virtual. And I mean, the entire chat is just compliments, affirmations, encouragement, pride, support. And so I think they build that with each other to be able to take risks. So part of it is me as an adult, but a lot of it is their peers. So it's an exciting and interesting journey to be on. And I think as an adult, it inspires me to take more risks, which is always a nice outcome that I didn't expect.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, going off of the last session a bit, how do you kind of incorporate these themes of diversity and equity and inclusion into this risk-taking conversation. How is it involved at all in your work, modeling behavior, understanding how adolescents think and act?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it relates back to what we were just talking about, also the language around failure and who's allowed to fail in what, right? So I think there might be really big differences in what different people in the community might be able to explore and even explore, right? So I think also you think about relationships or intimate relationships. And if you think about, for instance, just gender as an example, like what boys can do, what girls can do, and how people think about that in exploring, for instance, intimate relationships, that's very different. And if it's sort of exploring your own sexuality, and if it's exploring a same-sex relationship, if a girl may do this or a boy may do this, it would be very different. If they then say, it wasn't for me. Okay, that can happen, but it might be very different. So I think in many of these ways is like what's allowed, and also how people fail or look at the supposed failure, or saying like, okay, I don't want to do this. That might be very different for different communities. And I think then already, and this is something we talked about at the table too, so there are sort of pathways that are even closed off already a priori for some people. If you think, we talked about different studies you could choose between, like in the university, that for some groups it's just like there's a very clear pathway already. You should be doing some of these 3 things, so you can't really explore all the other ones.
I guess I was thinking, since we engage young people from so many different lived experiences and intersecting identities, we usually start with a lot of storytelling. So we do a lot of, check-in questions, breakout rooms, prompts, opportunities for people to share their thoughts, opinions, and experiences. And a lot of that is just practicing active listening. And it's really great to see young people be like, oh, I'm not from an immigrant family, and I didn't really think about my perception of education in comparison to yours. Like, that's super helpful for me to have a little bit more gratefulness for what I did have that you're now sharing was a different experience. So I think part of it is storytelling and building community and relationships. And then I think part of it is exploring, we do some exploration around organizing, right? So if you're going to build a project and engage people, there's a series of that where you're talking about systems and power hierarchies, and these are all young people, so their commonality is they're facing adultism. There's going to be some adults that are always going to support what they want to do no matter what, and others that are going to constantly question them. They're going to create more barriers, or they're just going to say, you can't do that. Like, you just can't do that. And so there's a student I was thinking about who lived outside of LA. She went to a very diverse high school. She's a Ghanaian American student. And she was one of the only Black people in all of her AP classes. And she was looking at her school demographics and asking, why am I the only Black person in this classroom for advanced courses? There's a lot of other students in my class that look like me that aren't here. And so she designed her project around engaging specifically Black and African students into understanding what AP was, why they would want to join, and how to make it more accessible. And her administration was freaked out that she titled her project the Black AP Expo. And they were very like, well, you can't just only make it for Black people. And she's like, but that's who's missing. And so it was like very brave of her to figure out how to navigate that. And she had some, adult ally support. But she did not waver. She was like, I'm not going to change the name to make you more comfortable. I'm not saying that other people aren't invited, but my project is for this group of people because we're not in the room. And I was like, okay. And so that was another thing around, she was connecting that systems were creating barriers and that certain people needed more access. And she reflected that identity and was in a place of courage and strength and support to be able to continue pushing back. And though her project hit a lot of roadblocks that I think slowed her progress, what she did was still true to her mission. And she was able to engage a small group of African and Black students to engage in AP. So it was pretty cool to witness, but it was also me being a white woman. I can't tell her what she should or shouldn't do. I'm not in her shoes. And so all I could do was sort of ask questions and ask her questions about consequences and safety, right? Like, if you piss off your principal, what are some consequences? What are ways that you could talk to them that they might hear you? What are you willing to risk or not risk, right? And so we always talk about a growing edge. So if you have 3 concentric circles, the one in the middle is where you're safest. I'm comfortable, I feel good here, I got it. The next circle out is your growing edge, where you feel like, oh, this is a little bit scary, I don't know what's gonna happen, but I still think I could do it. But the circle outside of that is like danger zone. I'm not ready, don't push me, this isn't safe, or this might be an experience that is a negative learning moment instead of a positive. And so we use that visualization and ask them, like, okay, where is your growing edge? And then at what point is it too far? And I might nudge you, but I'm not going to tell you where you should and shouldn't challenge, because if she decided to change the name of her expo or, fall in line with what administration was saying they thought she should do, I'm not going to say, you're wrong for that. It was just sort of exploring the critical thinking around where was her brave space and what was safe for her.
And that's such a good way to think about how to support risk-taking, kind of fostering where that safety is and where you're comfortable in order to then venture out and grow. Do you have any thoughts on
Yeah, no, I think it was also a great example of this positive peer influence in a way. And I was thinking that was another thing that I think is really important, and we also saw it in the stories of Jamila, that this idea that you're not doing it alone. So I was just looking at the picture here, and the previous one, there's always one person in it. I think we need more, right? So, and I think often when people do something like this, like jumping out of an airplane, they would do it with a friend. You don't do this alone, or explore that, right? And that's actually the crucial thing. So also this. For me also, I've been looking at this peer influence. I think we started reading about it from the science perspective. It was really about the negative aspect. And you had, resistance to peer influence skill. And so better, higher scores better because you resist peer influence. But now when you think about these examples, that's not good, right? You should actually be engaging with your peers, and you should listen to them. And you should do things together, and you should learn how to do that, right? And here it's also, you couldn't tell her what to do, but also you couldn't tell the other students, but she could, right? Help them take that risk and also join the program or other things. And that's also something that in my work, have been looking at, like, who are those peers and how can they support them? How can they do stuff together? And how can you actually leverage that peer influence to have this smart risk taking? Because they can also learn from each other's experiences once they feel comfortable to talk about that, right? And then again, you have to change the language, because you don't want to talk about all your failures, but you can talk about all the experiments you did, right? So that sounds way better. It's like, oh, I tried this and that, and didn't like it. That's fine. But it's like, oh, I failed 3 times. That's not really the right language. Yeah. So I think that also there we can sort of help them, communicate about these in different ways, and that they support each other in this risk taking.
I think listening to you also reminds me there's danger in them comparing themselves to others, because a lot of young people will be like, well, I saw what she did, and she was so vulnerable, and she shared her story, and it was so powerful, and I want to do that too. And I was like, well, you're not her, so your vulnerability is different, and you're in a different place. And I notice a lot that they compare themselves to each other about like what I should or shouldn't be doing. And so we're constantly like reminding them that's inspiration or that's encouragement, but you don't have to do what someone else did to be able to be just as powerful. And so we talked too about different ways of leadership, like some leaders are more quiet or soft-spoken or not necessarily on the stage, right? That doesn't make you better or worse, it's just different. And so hearing you made me think a lot about, I think some of the fear of taking a risk is feeling like, oh, you saw someone else do it and you have to do it that way too. And if the outcome isn't the same, you're going to fail. Mm-hmm. And we've been talking about sports a lot with risks, but you know, like if you try out for a sport and you make the team and you're not very great, is that a failure versus someone else who's the star player, right? Like it's hard not to compare yourself and be like, oh, they got MVP. But you know, on the flip side, well, as a soccer player, I defended a lot of goals. I never made any goals, but I sure as heck got them out, you know. So it's like, okay, that's my story and that's me and that's what matters versus like just the comparison I think is really hard, especially always, but especially in adolescence when you're still sort of figuring out where your confidence is and where you're grounded.
So could you tell me a little more about like these projects that you do with do they work together or they work with one educator to work on their project?
Yeah.
Or do they work together as students?
So we're actually building a new cohort now, and every student nominates an educator from their school or a school partner organization to work alongside them. So they join the program with one adult ally. And as a cohort, they work together because they're all challenged to do the same thing, to explore their own leadership and to create a project. But within that, they're all living in different communities and they're all working on different things. And so eventually they do build a team. And that's another thing we push pretty hard is many scholars start the program with this conception of, I will do this all myself, I have got it. Yeah, I'm going to take on every role, I'm going to do it all. And I'm also going to apply for college and financial aid and play soccer and watch my sibling after school and whatever else they're doing. And so I think it's a good reminder, these young people have responsibilities equal to my own and then some. You know, I'm a parent, I work. And so I'm constantly sort of amazed at all they're doing, but we're practicing all the time what's your yeses and what's your nos. And then part of leadership is shared leadership. Like, you can't do this all on your own. And we're engaging them when they're becoming seniors in high school. So the other natural part of that evolution is you will be graduating and you will be leaving high school. So you're creating a project that is meant to live on after you. So who are you building on your team that's going to carry this forward? And some people design apprentice or intern roles. Other people have second in commands or co-leaders. But I think a lot of the leadership they practice is, how do you found something that you care so deeply about that you can also let go of so other leaders can evolve it who are still a part of that community? And, you know, coming from a lot of nonprofits, if I could have learned that earlier on, right? We all talk about founder syndrome or like people being so resistant to change. So it's really fascinating to watch them build their teams because by the end, they're so excited for the next person to take on the project, usually, not always, but usually. And they're so proud of them, right? They're just like, oh my God, she's gonna like, you don't know what her plans are for next year. She's gonna be great. And then they move into a coach and a mentor role, or they just move on, right? Like, it's okay to just go to college or go to work or whatever it is you're doing. But also that pride that your project that you created is still happening. There is a legacy feeling of like, even if it's something small, like, oh, I made a difference. And we had a student where her whole legacy was really pushing her very rural, homogeneous school to think about gender identity differently by changing graduation gowns from being 2 colors. If you're a girl, you wear white. If you're a boy, you wear green, to 1 color. Her community lost it. It was like a long-standing tradition. It created so much drama, conflict. She stayed with it. There was community engagement meetings. There was town halls. There was Facebook petitions about the gown color. And at the end of the year, even through all of that, and she wanted to accomplish 8,000 other things, the gown color is changing. You know, people will still be pissed about it for some years, and somebody's grandma is still shaking her fist. But we reflected together, and she was like, I feel so good about it. You know, and some people might be cool, gown color. And she's like, no, that's the first seed of inclusion. Mm-hmm. This is a big deal. And I'm not from a rural community. I've never been in her town, but listening to her, I was like, dang, you did that. So it's pretty exciting to see these little sparks, which build efficacy. Because now when she goes to college, I mean, the fact that she persevered through that experience and managed a lot of conflict, it's not her comfort whatsoever. She was such a compassionate leader, and she didn't necessarily make everybody happy, but she was really steadfast in what she did.
That's amazing. Awesome. Okay, I think we are almost out of time. Maybe just some last thoughts. Do you have any last thoughts about how to support risk-taking in adolescence?
Well, I think what I really like about the end of this story is that there's also many things, there's not always, and we talked about this at the table too, there's not the optimal right answer. And not everybody's going to be happy, right? So, and I think that's also really good to tell them, okay, you're going to do this, and you're not going to keep everybody happy, ever, right? That's not, so it's not possible. And there's also like different ways of doing things, and there might be also fine, right? It's not about being the MVP, but you could, I mean, there's different roles we can play, and some fit better than others with you, so right? And it's really about finding that, and then yeah. So I thought that was a nice thought.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much to both of you. We're going to break out into table discussions now, and so once again, just talk about anything that resonated with you or anything you think that you'd like to add to the conversation. Thank you.